Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today we're looking at global power dynamics,
Definitely a hot topic.
especially for those UPSC aspirants out there studying international relations.
Absolutely crucial for understanding the world today.
Anyone else interested in global politics? This is for you too.
You bet.
We're going to be talking about some pretty big ideas.
Yeah, we've got the potential rise of China
The future of the U.S.
and what it all means for the idea of an international community.
We've got some really insightful sources to guide us through this.
Offering some really sharp analysis.
So let's start with kind of the big picture here.
Okay.
The so-called American century.
Right.
For most of the 20th century, the U.S. was really the dominant force globally.
Yeah, especially after World War II and during the Cold War.
But now as we move deeper into the 21st century, there's a lot of talk about a potential shift in power.
Yeah, with China emerging as a major player.
Exactly. And one of the big arguments for this shift is China's incredible economic growth.
Oh, absolutely. They became the world's second largest economy back in 2010.
Wow.
And they've just continued to expand their influence on the world stage.
So it's tempting to just say, okay, the 21st century is going to be the Chinese century.
Right?
But is it really that simple?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Our sources seem to suggest there are two very different ways this could all unfold.
Yeah, there are definitely a couple of different scenarios here.
Okay, so what's the first one?
Well, one scenario, and this is often put forward by offensive realist thinkers like John Mearsheimer,
Okay.
suggests that this transition of power could be full of tension,
Uh-oh.
even conflict.
Oh, no.
Mearsheimer argues that, rising powers, they inevitably challenge the existing order.
Right.
And the dominant power rarely gives up its position without a fight.
So essentially, we're looking at a potential clash of the titans
It's a possibility.
between China and the U.S.
Yeah.
That's a pretty sobering thought.
I mean, Mearsheimer points to historical examples like World War I
Oh,
and World War II,
okay.
periods of intense instability
Right.
when the global order was in flux
Uh-huh.
and a new hegemon was trying to assert itself.
Right.
Not exactly a comforting precedent.
No, not at all. But our sources also present a more optimistic perspective.
Yeah, they do.
There's a possibility that this transition could happen more peacefully.
Yeah, some argue that globalization might actually change the game entirely.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, the idea is that with economies so intertwined, countries are actually incentivized to cooperate
Okay.
and maintain stability.
Makes sense.
Even a rising China
Yeah.
might see its interests best served by maintaining a cooperative global system
Right.
rather than, rocking the boat too violently.
So instead of focusing on military dominance, we might see a world where economic power is the main driver.
It's possible.
And China could lead this new world order, but with a focus on collaboration and shared prosperity.
That's the theory, at least.
And do we have any historical examples of this kind of peaceful transition?
Well, we do have one historical example of a relatively peaceful transition of power, the decline of the British Empire, and the rise of the United States.
Interesting.
While there were definitely tensions and conflicts along the way,
Sure.
Britain ultimately accepted a less dominant role on the global stage.
Okay, so the question is whether the U.S. could adapt similarly to a rising China.
That's the big question.
That's a big if.
Yeah, especially given the current state of U.S.-China relations.
For sure, but let's say for argument's sake that China does want a peaceful rise.
Okay.
Are there any internal challenges that they might face that could complicate things?
Oh, there are definitely some hurdles.
Like what?
Well, while their economic growth has been phenomenal,
It really has.
they still lag behind the U.S. in some key areas.
Oh, okay, like
technological development and military power.
So even if their economy continues to boom, there are other gaps they need to bridge before they can truly challenge U.S. dominance.
I think that's right.
On a global scale,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the specific challenges they face?
Well, for one, there are questions about whether China's political system
Okay.
can adapt to the demands of a rapidly changing, increasingly globalized economy.
Right.
Their current structure with the Communist Party at the helm might not be agile enough to keep pace with a dynamic, market-driven economy.
It does seem like a bit of a contradiction.
It does, yeah.
And on top of that, China's economic success has relied heavily on cheap labor and exports.
Right.
But as their population ages and wages rise, that model might not be sustainable in the long run.
You've hit on a crucial point.
So China needs to figure out how to restructure its economy
Yeah.
to rely more on domestic demand
Mm-hmm.
and move towards higher value industries.
Exactly.
It's a massive undertaking, and it's not clear how smoothly they can pull it off.
It's a huge challenge.
So China's rise is far from a sure thing.
No, it's not a guarantee by any means.
There are internal and external factors that could affect their trajectory.
Definitely.
Which brings us to another fascinating question, this whole international community idea.
Okay.
Is that a real thing, a driving force in global affairs? Or is it more of a feel-good concept
Right.
that gets tossed around but doesn't have much teeth?
The international community.
Right.
It's a
Yeah.
term we hear all the time, but what does it really mean in practice?
To me, it sounds like the ideal scenario, countries setting aside their differences
Mm-hmm.
and working together for the common good.
Yeah.
But is that too idealistic?
I mean, it depends on who you ask.
Okay.
Some theorists argue that even though individual countries are driven primarily by self-interest,
Right.
there's also a growing sense of shared norms and values
Okay.
that shape their interactions.
So they see the global stage not just as a chaotic free-for-all,
Yeah,
but as a kind of society of states where cooperation is possible.
exactly.
Okay, so maybe there's some structure,
Yeah,
some common ground, even amidst the competition.
I think so.
But the international community concept suggests something even more cohesive than just a society.
It does, yeah.
It implies bonds of mutual respect, shared responsibility for global well-being.
Right. It takes it a step further.
So more like close friends looking out for each other,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just acquaintances following the same social rules.
I like that analogy.
When did this idea really gain traction?
Well, the term itself has been around for a while,
Okay.
but it gained serious momentum in the 1990s after the Cold War ended.
I see.
It was a time of optimism,
Right.
with the superpower rivalry kind of fading into the background.
Right.
Many saw it as an opportunity for countries to genuinely cooperate
Yeah.
and work together.
Makes sense, but not everyone bought into this optimistic vision, right?
Oh, of course not.
Weren't there some pretty strong critiques of the international community concept?
Absolutely. Realists, for instance, maintain that self-interest will always trump any feel-good notions of global solidarity.
Makes sense.
They saw the international community as a bit of a charade,
Oh, wow.
a way for powerful countries to mask their self-serving actions in the language of morality.
So essentially, realists believe that countries will always act in their own best interests, regardless of what they say about working for the common good.
That's pretty much the gist of it.
Okay, then there's the postcolonial critique,
Right.
which argues that this whole international community framework often seems rather Eurocentric.
Yeah.
It raises concerns about whether Western powers are genuinely acting in the best interests of the community as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
or if they're simply perpetuating their dominance over less powerful nations.
It's a valid concern.
It makes you wonder if some of those interventions,
Makes it-
those efforts to promote peace or democracy
Right.
were truly about helping people, or if they were just a new form of colonialism disguised as humanitarianism.
It's a question worth asking.
So it seems like the international community, even if well-intentioned, is a bit of a double-edged sword.
I think that's a good way to put it.
It can be a force for good, but it can also be misused or even make things worse.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the international community isn't some monolithic entity.
Right.
It's a collection of states with diverse interests, values, and priorities.
Okay.
Sometimes those interests align,
Yeah.
leading to cooperation. Other times they clash, resulting in gridlock or even conflict.
Okay, so let's pause here for a moment.
Right.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, from the American century to the potential rise of China, and from the hopes for a genuine international community to the realities of power politics. It's enough to make your head spin,
A lot to take in.
but understanding these fundamental concepts is crucial for anyone trying to make sense of global politics, especially for our UPSC aspirants out there.
Couldn't agree more.
And we're just getting started in part 2 of this deep dive. We'll delve even deeper into the international community concept and how it plays out on the world stage.
Looking forward to it.
We'll be back with more insights and analysis. Welcome back to our deep dive into the future of global power. We just finished discussing the international community and how realists and postcolonial critics view it. It seems like the idea has some serious flaws, but it's still a concept we hear all the time. Where did this idea even come from?
Well, to understand the international community, it helps to go back to its roots
Okay.
in international society theory.
Okay.
And that takes us all the way back to the 17th century.
Wow.
and a guy named Hugo Grotius.
Hugo Grotius.
A real pioneer of international law.
Okay, so this isn't exactly a new idea.
Nope.
What was Grotius's big contribution?
Grotius believed that even war shouldn't be a chaotic free-for-all.
Okay.
He argued that there should be rules, principles of justice that govern even armed conflict.
So even way back then, people were trying to find ways to create a more orderly and just world.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And this idea that shared norms and principles should guide relations between states,
right,
even rivals, is the foundation of international society theory.
So how is international society different from the international community?
Right.
Is it just a matter of words, or is there a real distinction?
It's a subtle but important difference. International society suggests that countries interact with each other in somewhat predictable ways, following patterns shaped by shared norms and values. These norms can be debated and challenged, of course.
Right.
But the idea is that there's some common ground.
So it's not just pure anarchy out there.
Right.
There's some structure, some shared understanding.
Exactly. But international community takes it a step further.
Okay, how so?
It suggests a deeper sense of unity. Shared purpose, almost a sense of belonging to something larger than oneself.
Okay, I'm starting to see the difference.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between following traffic laws, because you know you have to,
right,
and actually caring about the safety of other drivers on the road.
That's a good analogy. International society is about acknowledging the rules of the game, while international community implies a more genuine concern for collective well-being.
But as we discussed in the last part, this international community seems pretty fragile.
Yeah.
Self-interest and power politics can easily undermine it.
Unfortunately, that's true. And the declining emphasis on the international community after the 1990s is a testament to that fragility. It had a moment in the sun, but it seems to have faded as great power competition has returned.
So where does that leave us? Is the future of global politics just going to be an endless cycle of conflict and competition? Or is there still hope for a more cooperative and just world order?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball.
Oh, go on.
But I think there are reasons to be both hopeful and cautious. On the one hand, we've seen how interconnected the world has become. Global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and financial crises demand cooperation on an unprecedented scale.
That's true. No single country can tackle those problems alone.
Exactly.
We really are all in this together.
And this growing interdependence could push countries toward finding common ground and working together. Even if it's just out of self-interest, they might be forced to cooperate just to survive.
So maybe the international community isn't dead. It's just evolving.
It's possible.
Maybe this interdependence will force it to become more practical.
Yeah.
And less idealistic.
Perhaps. But we also have to be realistic about the challenges. Power dynamics are constantly in flux.
True.
And there will always be those who prioritize their own interests over the common good.
It's a balancing act, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to promote cooperation while acknowledging the realities of power and self-interest. How do we find that balance?
That's the million-dollar question.
I know, right?
There are no easy answers. But understanding these complexities is the first step. We need to be aware of how power operates on the global stage and how it shapes the possibilities for cooperation.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of theoretical ground here.
We have.
We've explored the historical context, the nuances of international society versus international community, and the challenges facing any attempt to build a more cooperative world order.
Indeed. We've laid a good foundation.
We have. But we're not done yet. In part 3 of this deep dive, we're going to shift gears a bit and look at how these abstract concepts play out in real-world situations.
Sounds good.
We'll explore some specific examples and see how theory meets reality.
Looking forward to it.
Exactly. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll get down to the nitty-gritty of global politics. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into global power dynamics. We've spent the last 2 parts exploring the ideas of the American century, the potential Chinese century, and the complexities of the international community. Now let's see how these ideas play out in the real world.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how these theoretical frameworks actually manifest in concrete events.
Exactly. So are there any particular events that come to mind as good examples of the international community in action? Or perhaps struggling to act?
Well, those humanitarian interventions we touched on earlier are a prime example. The 1999 intervention in Kosovo is a particularly interesting case.
Okay, what happened there?
You had a brutal crackdown by Serbian forces against ethnic Albanians.
Oh, wow.
And the world was watching in horror.
Right.
There were urgent calls for intervention, but the UN Security Council was paralyzed because Russia, a Serbian ally, wouldn't approve any action.
So if the UN was gridlocked, how did the international community respond?
Right.
Did they just stand by and watch?
Well, in that case, NATO, led by the U.S., decided to intervene without a UN mandate.
Oh, wow. So they went ahead on their own.
They did.
Okay.
They launched airstrikes against Serbian targets, which eventually forced Serbia to withdraw from Kosovo.
So action was taken. But it was a controversial move.
It was.
Bypassing the UN Security Council raised a lot of questions about the legitimacy of the intervention.
Absolutely. And that highlights one of the biggest dilemmas when it comes to the international community.
What's that?
Who gets to decide when and how to intervene?
Right. Is it just the powerful countries calling the shots?
Yeah.
Or is there a more legitimate, agreed-upon process?
It's a tough question.
It is, and Kosovo isn't the only example of this kind of intervention, right?
Right. The 2011 intervention in Libya is another case in point.
Okay, what happened there?
Again, you had a brutal dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, violently suppressing protests.
Right.
And the international community felt compelled to act.
Okay.
This time, there was a UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force to protect civilians.
Okay.
But the mission quickly went beyond that limited scope.
So it wasn't just about protecting civilians anymore.
Right. It ended up being a full-fledged regime change operation, with Gaddafi being ousted and ultimately killed.
And what's happened since then?
Well, Libya has been struggling with instability and conflict ever since.
It's a cautionary tale.
It is.
It shows how even when there's a genuine desire to protect civilians and promote peace, these interventions can have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And can be easily hijacked by competing interests.
Exactly. So this international community idea seems like a double-edged sword.
It does.
It can be a force for good, but it can also be misused or even make things worse.
It's important to remember that the international community isn't a single entity acting with one mind.
Right.
It's a collection of states, each with its own interests and agendas.
Exactly. Sometimes those interests align and you get cooperation.
Right.
Other times they collide and you get gridlock or conflict.
So it's more like a big, messy family trying to figure things out with all the drama and dysfunction that comes with it.
Yeah, a very apt analogy.
But even within this family, there are different power dynamics at play.
Sure.
We've talked a lot about the U.S. and China, but what about other major players like Russia,
Yeah.
the European Union, India, Brazil? It's not just a two-horse race anymore.
Definitely not. We're seeing the rise of what some call a multipolar world where power is more distributed.
How does this shift affect the international community? Does it make it easier or harder to act?
It's a mixed bag. On the one hand, it can make reaching consensus and taking collective action more difficult.
Okay, why is that?
Well, with more players at the table, there are more interests to balance more potential for disagreement.
It's like trying to get everyone in a large family to agree on where to go for dinner.
Exactly. But on the other hand, a multipolar world can also create space for more diverse voices and perspectives.
Okay.
Emerging powers like China, India, and Brazil are demanding a greater say in global affairs,
Right.
challenging the traditional dominance of the West.
This is a more complex and dynamic landscape,
It is.
which means there are both challenges and opportunities.
Precisely. And that's why understanding these evolving power dynamics is so crucial for anyone trying to navigate the world of international relations.
It sounds like it.
It's not just about who has the biggest military or the most money.
Right.
It's about how these actors interact, cooperate, and compete on a global stage that's constantly in flux.
Well said. This deep dive has really helped to unpack some of the core ideas shaping global politics today. We've gone from the historical context of the American century to the potential rise of China, explored the complexities of the international community, and looked at how these ideas play out in real-world events.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It has.
And I hope our listeners have come away with a deeper understanding of these crucial issues.
I agree. And for our UPSC aspirants out there, this deep dive has hopefully given you some valuable insights for your international relations studies.
Absolutely. Understanding these power dynamics is essential for anyone analyzing global politics.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. I know it flew by. A big thank you to our expert for sharing their knowledge and insights.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Deep Dive for more explorations of fascinating topics. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new subject. Until then, keep learning and stay curious.